When you think of North Korea, you probably think of extravagant military parades, unnecessarily aggressive newsreaders, and Kim Jong-un's impeccable fashion sense. You probably don't think of footballing excellence, or not initially at least. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which isn't always quite as democratic as its name would have you believe, has been described as the most isolated country in the world. But it's also a country that is obsessed with football. North Korea famously reached the quarterfinals of the 1966 World Cup in England, where they recorded a major upset against Italy and raced into a 3-0 lead against Portugal, greatly endearing themselves to the English viewing public. The DPRK men's team qualified for a second World Cup in 2010, where they performed valiantly in a 2-1 defeat against 5-time world champions Brazil, only undone by a freak goal by Maicon from a seemingly impossible angle, before getting thrashed 7-0 by Portugal. Despite an expanded format in 2026, North Korea have failed to qualify for the upcoming World Cup, which is co-hosted by Canada, Mexico, and the imperialist pigs, the United States, possibly for the best. In the women's game, however, North Korea aren't plucky underdogs who qualify for the World Cup once in a blue moon. They are established powerhouses, especially at youth team level, where they are undeniably the best team in the world. When the United Nations states that the DPRK, quote, does not have any parallel in the contemporary world, end quote, they are referring to the country's appalling human rights record, but they could just as easily, and just as accurately, be referring to their under-17 women's team. North Korea beat the Netherlands 3-0 in the FIFA Under-17 Women's World Cup final last week, during a game in which they had 9 shots on target, and 26 in total, while restricting the Dutch team to just 5 shots, and only one which forced goalkeeper Kim Song-yong into making a save. A magnanimous Olivier Amelink, head coach of the Dutch Under-23 and Under-17 women's teams, conceded following the defeat that, quote, I don't think that we could have beaten them. I think the gap is simply too big to compete with them at the moment. They outplayed us throughout the entire match. End quote. It's the second time in as many years that North Korea have lifted the Under-17 Women's World Cup, and their 4th in total, which is twice as many as any other nation, in a competition which the likes of England, Germany, and the United States have never won. The DPRK had already thrashed their final opponents, the Netherlands, 5-0 during the group stage, at a tournament where they scored 25 goals, an average of over 3.5 goals a game, and only conceded 3. It was a similar story last year in the Dominican Republic, where North Korea's Under-17s beat England 4-0 in the group stage, knocked the United States out in the semis, and beat Spain in the final, only conceding 2 goals in 7 games all tournaments. It's not just North Korea's Under-17s, their Under-20s have also won the joint most Under-20 Women's World Cups, tied with Germany and the United States, including the most recent edition in Colombia in 2024, where they beat Argentina 6-2 and Costa Rica 9-0, with 8 different goal scorers in that game, and where they didn't concede a single goal in either the quarterfinal, semi-final, or the final versus Brazil, the United States, and Japan, en route to lifting the trophy. North Korea are also the reigning champions of the Under-17 and Under-20 Women's Asian Cups, further cementing their status as the best underage team in the world in the women's game. But just why are they so good? Why are their women's teams so much better than their men's? And why is their senior women's team, who've never reached a Women's World Cup semis, and who are currently ranked 10th in the world, not nearly as dominant as their junior sides? Well, these are all valid and intriguing questions, or I thought so at least, which have been put to me by several subscribers and channel members, and which few Western media outlets seem to be particularly interested in examining, so I thought that I'd take a stab at answering them. You too can become part of my burgeoning community of channel members, if you would like to support my work, either via the Alfie Potsama YouTube channel, or via buymeacoffee.com/AlfiePotsama, for as little as £2.99 a month, and then you can also help determine which videos I make on this and the Alfie Potsama YouTube channels next. There are links to both in the video description. Alright, that's the advertising done. Now sit back, relax, and join me on the not especially well-trodden journey to Pyongyang as we take a look at why the best young female footballers on the planet hail from North Korea, why the DPRK struggle to replicate that success in either the men's or the senior women's games, and whether North Korea are now sleeping giants sitting on an unprecedented golden generation of talent capable of taking the world by storm. One argument for why the DPRK is so successful in women's youth football is that the North Korean regime use it as a useful propaganda tool to enhance their reputation with domestic and international audiences. The theory goes that North Korea observed that women's football, and especially the early part of women and girls' development, was relatively neglected by most countries, and therefore identified it as having the lowest barrier to entry for them to become competitive and ultimately successful within the sport. The focus, it is claimed, is not on creating a pathway to professionalism or helping young players to hone their skills, as is the case in most countries, but on winning in the here and now so that their successes can be packaged and sold off as a victory for the regime. This is used to explain why North Korea is so successful at youth level, but less successful within the senior game, because the focus isn't on long-term development, but on instant results. Amusingly, this is the same criticism that was made of England's mentality within academies and the national youth setup for many decades, albeit with less sinister motives typically projected onto the FA and English clubs. It's also claimed that major incentives for players in their personal lives, like accommodation in Pyongyang, an immense privilege compared to life in North Korea's more impoverished provinces, along with other awards, provides young players with greater and more immediate incentives than those throughout most of the rest of the world. These are the prevailing theories, within the often detailed and source-light reporting by Western media outlets, used to explain the DPRK's success in women's youth football, and there is likely some truth to some of those claims, as we will come on to, but it reeks of dismissive Orientalism, which colours so much of the sensationalist coverage of North Korea. One article, by the Israeli online newspaper Ynet, for example, claimed that, quote, "Concepts like fun or joy in the game don't make it past the front gates," end quote, when referring to North Korean academies and training centres. That is just patently absurd. It's also frequently claimed that the North Korean teams are successful because they endure military-style training, they are incredibly physically fit, and they are highly organised, the implication here being that their success owes to their stamina and organisation, as opposed to their flair, invention, or technical prowess. This is a notion which can be very easily dismissed just by watching any of North Korea's games at the 2025 Under-17 Women's World Cup, where they scored the most goals of any team in the entire history of the competition, and played by far the most exhilarating and entertaining brand of football of any team at the tournament. It is true that the North Korean players appear to be physically very fit, never stop running, and have excellent defensive shape. The same can be said, of course, of almost every very good football team, but it's also true to say that their play is incredibly varied, full of joy and expression, one-touch passing, clever feints and body swerves, and brilliant finishing. North Korea's football doesn't fit neatly into the stereotype of a hyper-militarized society, which rejects any displays of individualism. Cho Il-son, who was part of the North Korean Under-17 and Under-20 teams that won both of their respective Women's World Cups just 2 months apart last year, played with a sheer dynamism, explosive enthusiasm, and set of attacking instincts that changed the atmosphere of the entire stadium every time that she got on the ball. Barney Ronay in The Guardian likened her to a teenage Wayne Rooney or Michael Owen, full of fearless direct running, an eagerness to take players on, and an unrelenting sense of self-belief. At the 2025 Under-17 Women's World Cup, it was forward Yoo Jong-hyang and young prodigy Kim Won-sim, possibly the most talented 16-year-old and 15-year-old female footballers in the world right now, who caught the eye with their mazy runs and unerring finishing in front of goal as the two leading candidates for the tournament's Golden Boot and Golden Ball. When interviewed, North Korean players will always emphasise the importance of their team and credit their teammates for their own successes and individual accolades. This is often presented in quite sinister tones, though it is, of course, how the vast majority of footballers from all countries respond when presented with individual awards or when interviewed after matches. The frequent mentions of the dear leader, admittedly perhaps, are a little less common. A far more likely explanation for North Korea's failure to transfer youth team success over into the senior game, and for some of their difficulties in terms of development as players enter into their 20s, is the country's lack of a highly competitive professional women's league and the inability of their players to go and compete overseas. In response to North Korea's test launch of Hwasong-15 in November 2017, the country's first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, that is theoretically capable of reaching the United States mainland, the United Nations unanimously adopted a sweep of new sanctions on the DPRK. United Nations Security Council Resolution 2397, adopted just the following month, ordered all UN member states to repatriate any North Korean nationals drawing an income in their territories, so everyone excluding defectors, within the next 24 months, in addition to prohibiting UN member states from issuing any future work authorizations or permits to North Koreans. These sanctions were further tightened by UN Resolution 2515 in 2020. You may recall that, prior to this, there were a spate of North Korean footballers who made unprecedented moves overseas. Although several Japanese-born ethnic Koreans eligible to represent North Korea have played abroad in the past, most notably brief Bundesliga forward Jong Tae-se, who was made famous for his tears during the national anthem at the 2010 World Cup, before the 2010s, only a handful of native North Koreans had ever played football outside of the DPRK, and exclusively in Russia, China and Serbia. In the 2010s, however, Pak Song-chol and Cho Myung-ho joined clubs in Cambodia, Jong Il-gwon and Pak Kwang-ryong joined clubs in Switzerland, and Cho Song-hyuk and Han Kwang-song made high-profile moves to Italian clubs. Kwang-song, most notably of all, made 7 appearances in Serie A, Italy's top flight, while playing for Cagliari as a 19-year-old, before he was signed by Juventus. All of these unprecedented moves were brought to a grounding halt by sanctions. Han Kwang-song, dubbed the North Korean Wonder Kid, effectively disappeared, with reports that the combination of sanctions and North Korea's extremely stringent COVID-19 travel restrictions had left him stranded at the North Korean embassy in China for between 2 to 3 years, before he resurfaced in a 2026 World Cup qualifier against Syria, when North Korea's first travel restrictions were finally lifted. Now North Korea's entire men's and women's national teams, at all age groups, play their club football in North Korea. Whereas other countries' best players are snapped up by the biggest clubs, with the best facilities, in the most competitive leagues at a relatively early age, like England's WSL or America's NWSL, the DPRK's best players are left to stagnate. Japan, by contrast, who are the strongest women's team in Asia, alongside North Korea, at both youth team and senior level, not only have a comprehensive professional women's league of their own, over half of their senior squad play their club football in England, including almost their entire starting 11 at times, whilst others play in Spain, Germany and the United States, 3 of the world's strongest women's leagues. It's a similar story with Canada, Sweden, and virtually all of the world's leading women's teams, with the sole exception of North Korea. From that perspective, it is actually fairly remarkable that North Korea's women's team are still ranked as the 10th best in the world, above the likes of Italy, Norway, and the Netherlands. I suspect that accounts for most of the gap between the performances and successes of North Korea's youth teams and their senior team, and I think that it is extremely plausible to imagine that if North Korean girls from the ages of 18 or 19 onwards had the same pathways and development opportunities as English, Japanese, Spanish or American girls of the same age, then they may well be just as dominant at senior international level. Yoo Jong-hyung and Kim Won-sim, 2 of the recent stars of North Korea's Under-17 Women's World Cup success, who I described only a moment ago as being possibly the most talented 15 and 16-year-old female footballers on the planet, most likely won't still be the most talented players in their age group at either 25 or 30, because they will never have played regular club football outside of the DPRK. Elsewhere on the internet, you will find even more far-fetched and dismissive explanations for North Korea's success. Common themes include accusations that they are lying about the age of some, if not all, of their players, which is also presented as an explanation as to their failure to replicate their youth success at senior level, that they are lying about the sex of some, if not all, of their players, as in, they are actually boys or men, or the age-old trope that North Korea's players are simply more motivated than anyone else is, because if they don't win, they will be killed, or at the very least tortured. Now, the DPRK are of course no strangers to executions and a bit of draconian punishments, with some very well documented evidence of both over the years, but as I covered in a video about North Korea's 2010 World Cup team, who it was claimed by several media outlets have been sent to prison camps or tortured upon their return from South Africa to Pyongyang, there is little to no evidence of North Korean footballers, men or women, young or old, being imprisoned, tortured or killed as a result of poor results or performances. The idea that North Korea's players are lying about their age or sex is also totally baseless. It seems to me that these are presented in an effort to somehow dismiss or easily diminish North Korea's excellent young women's footballers, exhibiting a remarkable lack of curiosity to my mind about the reality of why things happen, in this case, North Korea producing immensely talented young players, which is so much more interesting than the myths. There is good reason to believe, for example, that North Korea's interest in women's football began because of Kim Jong-il several years before he replaced his father, and North Korea's founder Kim Il-sung, as the supreme leader of the DPRK. Kim Jong-il was confirmed as his father's heir apparent in the early 1980s, by which stage he had been running the country's propaganda and agitation department for more than 10 years. That is the pre-leadership role that North Korea's second supreme leader is most synonymous with, but during the 1980s, he is also reported to have taken over management of North Korean athletics and sports. Women's football was in the doldrums at this time. Several countries only lifted bans on women's football during the 1970s, and though Italy hosted an unofficial Women's World Cup, with just 7 teams in 1970, it wasn't until 1991 that FIFA sanctioned the first official Women's World Cup. In 1986, Norwegian woman Ellen Villa shocked the FIFA Congress by giving a speech in which she described the way in which FIFA and other governing bodies had neglected women's football, calling for a Women's World Cup and participation in the Olympics. In many ways, North Korea was ahead of the curve. Under Stalin, women were discouraged from playing several sports, including football, in the Soviet Union and in most Soviet-aligned nations, but following the 1956 August faction incident, in which leading North Koreans within the Soviet Korean faction tried and failed to overthrow the supreme leader Kim Il-sung, North Korea began to exercise greater autonomy from the USSR, including in women's sports. I wouldn't say that it was the main point of divergence. That was probably Soviet denunciation of personality cults post-Stalin, and the DPRK's full embrace of them, but it was one of them. April 25, the biggest and the most successful football club in North Korea, which is owned by North Korea's Ministry of Defense, founded North Korea's first official women's team in 1985, before, on the orders of Kim Jong-il, 18 women's teams were formed later that year. It helped that North Korea's neighbours, China, were also relatively early adopters of the women's game, lifting the first AFC Women's Championship, now the AFC Asian Women's Cup, in 1986, and hosting the 1988 FIFA Women's Invitational Tournament, which was the precursor to the FIFA Women's World Cup. The Soviet Union's women's football team, by contrast, was only founded in 1990, less than 2 years before the USSR collapsed. By the early 1990s, North Korea already had one of the strongest women's teams in Asia, winning bronze at the 1990 Asian Games, where they beat South Korea 7-0, reaching the semi-finals of the AFC Women's Championship in 1991, where they put 20 goals past Malaysia and Singapore in the group stage, and the final of the 1993 AFC Women's Championship, where they suffered their only defeat against China. In 1989, Kim Jong-il is reported to have stated, quote, "We should develop women's football. Recently, the skills of our women's football team has improved somewhat. They may be able to win international tournaments in the near future if they keep working hard." End quote. The pressure was on Kim Jong-il's sporting remit at this time, as South Korea, which had just transitioned into a democracy, successfully hosted the 1988 Summer Olympics in what was viewed as a major domestic and international PR victory for Seoul, and a huge blow for Pyongyang. North Korean claims, published in the state-controlled newspaper the Pyongyang Times, that, quote, If the Olympic Games were to be held in South Korea, many sportsmen and tourists of the world would meet death, infected with AIDS, end quote, surprisingly didn't materialise. It wasn't until 1998, 9 years after their first game, that the DPRK women's team played their first official fixture in North Korea, a 0-0 draw against Australia in front of a reported 58,000 people at the Kim Il-sung Stadium. At the time, this was an abnormal attendance within the women's game, at least outside of the United States, exceeding any Women's World Cup attendance with the sole exception of the final in Guangzhou in 1991. It was a similar story within North Korea's domestic women's league, where there are no publicly available attendance figures, but North Korean players are described as being national stars, who would repeatedly be stopped by fans on the streets. The makeup of North Korean football crowds, both men's and women's, in terms of their degree of autonomy in choosing to attend games, is a subject of great speculation and debate. But organic or not, North Koreans had a greater level of interest in women's football 3 decades ago than almost any other country on Earth. There was even a 3-part North Korean TV series titled Our Women's Soccer Team, which was a television drama following the fictional lives of a dramatised version of North Korea's national women's team, produced by North Korea's only female film director in 2011.
볼 좀 달라요. 볼? 발로 한번 투사해볼까? 발로도 투사할 수 있나요? 발로도 투사할 수 있지. 자신 있으면 거기서 한번 투사해보래요. 해보래요. 바람속도 약 1m, 고리 10m, 각도 40도. 자신 있어요? 보기나 해. 뻔한 걸 뭐. 이야. 자, 이래도.
North Korea produces about 1 new television drama a year, so the choice of subject matter is highly selective. There was also a non-fiction documentary about North Korea's women's team, produced by Austrian filmmaker Brigitte Weich in 2009, which focused especially on the lives of 4 of their players, titled Hannah Dul Said, and a follow-up film titled Ned Tassot Yosot, which was released in 2024. Both the fictional and real-life portrayals of women's football in North Korea were revealing. Our women's soccer team portrayed women defying the wishes of their parents to play football, forbidden love affairs, and one plot which centred on a girl who wanted to be the focal point of the team, only to be ostracised for prioritising herself over others. Ashamed, she subsequently asked to be removed from the team, but that request is also denied before she illustrates her commitment to the team as a collective and is successfully reintegrated. Hannah Dul Said, meanwhile, shows the sacrifices and motivations of the players in North Korea's women's team, or at least those that they were willing to volunteer on camera, such as having abortions during their playing days due to their commitment to the national team and not wanting to put their careers on hold, and repeated references to Kim Jong-il and wanting to please him with their results and performances. All 4 of the protagonists retire prematurely following the disappointment of losing 3-0 against Japan and failing to qualify for the 2004 Summer Olympics. One of the 4, Ri Yang-ok, has been a FIFA-listed referee since 2005 and even refereed at the 2019 Women's World Cup in France. I must admit, though I have watched as much of Hannah Dul Said as is publicly available, I haven't been able to find, and therefore watch, Our Women's Soccer Team, so my description of that is based solely upon reports by those who presumably have published elsewhere. I would never want to mislead you about my degree of understanding when it comes to North Korean television dramas. Now that's one of my 3, or maybe 4 strict rules on this channel. Following Kim Il-sung's death in 1994, which actually earned him a promotion from Supreme to Eternal Leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il's promotion to Supreme Leader cemented North Korea's focus on the women's game. Among other things. Again, I wouldn't say it was the main aspect. Under Kim Jong-il's leadership, boys and girls began playing football in school from an early age, regional scouts would make note of the most talented youngsters, who were then picked up by either one of the many army teams or, in the case of the best, Pyongyang's Central School of Excellence. The results were emphatic. In 2006, North Korea made their Under-20 Women's World Cup debut in Russia and won the entire tournament, beating France, Brazil, and eventually China 5-0 in the final. 2 years later, at the first ever FIFA Under-17 Women's World Cup in New Zealand, North Korea emerged victorious once again, this time seeing off Denmark, England, and finally the United States during the knockout stages. There was immense excitement around this crop of young North Korean girls and their prospects within the senior game, and for good reason. At the 2010 AFC Women's Asian Cup, where North Korea only lost on penalties against Australia in the final, there were 9 teenagers and 13 players aged 21 or below in North Korea's 23-woman squad. At the 2011 Women's World Cup, however, where North Korea's young guns, with only 6 players in their entire squad over the age of 21 and just 1 over 25, were expected to announce themselves to the world, they instead exited in disgrace after 5 of their players failed doping tests. North Korea were fined $400,000, which was the exact same value as their prize money, and banned from competing at the 2015 Women's World Cup, by which stage many of their golden generation would have been coming into their supposed primes. It was a monumental setback for the women's game in North Korea, compounded by failure to qualify for the 2019 Women's World Cup, missing out to rival South Korea solely by virtue of goal difference. 3 years later, North Korea withdrew from 2023 Women's World Cup qualifying, unable or unwilling to fulfill fixtures, owing to the country's strict COVID-19 travel restrictions. What all of that meant was that, following their first wave of dominance at youth team level, North Korea's women's team didn't appear at 3 successive Women's World Cups, being banned from 1, withdrawing from 1, and failing to qualify despite not losing any of their 10 qualifiers for the other. This, again, would seem to be a fairly compelling explanation as to why North Korea's success at senior level hasn't quite matched up to their youth team exploits. North Korea's current crop of incredibly talented youngsters, meanwhile, are in large part a byproduct of the Pyongyang International Football School, which was established in 2013. A state-of-the-art national training centre for both boys and girls, which you can visit and even participate in training sessions on guided tours. Maybe a video for the second channel there. The Pyongyang International Football School is where North Korea's most talented youngsters, between the ages of 7 and 17, gain their football and academic education. The academy lies adjacent to the Rungrado 1st of May Stadium, which is recognised as being the second largest stadium in the world by capacity, and students live in on-site accommodation. North Korea's current golden generation in the women's game, and, as we are about to touch upon, probably their best ever men's youth team as well, are viewed as a vindication of the Pyongyang International Football School and their methods. Not only has the Pyongyang School provided North Korea's most talented youngsters with excellent coaching and facilities, it is also just about the most centralised national training centre in the world. North Korea's 7 to 17-year-old footballers aren't in club academies, meaning they live and train with their peers full-time. The end result is a group of players, as in the case of North Korea's under-17s, who have been part of the same group for many years, some of them since they were as young as 7. When commentators on North Korean youth games sometimes remark about the team's togetherness and understanding, which is sometimes attributed to Juche ideology or some kind of fundamental national identity or ideology, it likely has a lot more to do with the simple fact that they have been forming these relationships, both on and off the pitch, and that degree of familiarity day in, day out, for several years. This isn't the case with the vast majority of national teams. Even the French, with Clairefontaine for example, which is highly centralised by international standards, the vast majority of France's current senior squad never spent any time there at all, only 4 of them by my counts, and even among those 4, they spent a limited amount of time there and also came through club academies. It is true, as is often reported by Western media outlets, that living in Pyongyang is a great privilege in North Korea, and it is one that is granted not only to youth team players studying at the Pyongyang school, but also, and to an even greater extent, senior international players, who are reportedly given apartments in Pyongyang and sufficient privileges to support their entire families off the back of their careers in football. This is obviously an enormous incentive for young players, just as the perks of potential multi-million-pound contracts are elsewhere in the world, though it is probably a little reductive to suggest that it is their sole, or perhaps even their primary motivation. North Korea's senior women's team, it should be said, have roared back following the lifting of the country's draconian COVID-19 restrictions, and more than a decade of setbacks, having only tasted defeat once, against Japan, in over 2 years. In fact, the last time that the Eastern Azaleas, as they're known, lost against anyone other than Japan was in August 2018, when they were undone by China in a group stage game at the Asian Games, after they had already qualified for the knockout stages. Though barely talked about as 2027 Women's World Cup contenders, where Spain, England and the United States are frequently talked up and considered to be the favourites, North Korea qualified for the 2026 AFC Women's Asian Cup with 3 wins from 3, scoring 26 goals and conceding none in the process, where reaching the semi-finals will guarantee them a spot at the Women's World Cup in Brazil. If they get there, they'll likely have the youngest squad at the tournament, containing several players from their all-conquering under-17 and especially under-20 teams, and they will be real dark horses. For all of the talk of North Korea's senior team not yet replicating the success of their youth teams, this is by far the most talented crop of young girls that the country has ever produced, and it is absolutely feasible that they could make a real splash in the senior game, even with all of the ongoing and, in some cases, worsening hurdles in terms of development touched upon in this video. As for the men's team, North Korea's senior men's team, they're not very good. They haven't reached the knockout stages of the Asian Cup since 1980, they finished below Kyrgyzstan in 2026 World Cup qualifying, and they are currently ranked 120th in the world, sandwiched between Sudan and Sierra Leone. Their under-17s, however, are currently in action at the FIFA Under-17 World Cup, which is held annually in Qatar, where they progressed from the group stage following a 1-1 draw against reigning Under-17 World Cup winners Germany. The German Under-17 World Cup squad is made up almost entirely, there are just 2 exceptions, of players in Bundesliga academies, some of whom, like Jeremiah Mensah and Abu Bakr, have already made senior appearances for Bayer Leverkusen and Eintracht Frankfurt in the Champions League and the Europa League. Wisdom Mike, who scored Germany's only goal in their 1-1 draw with the DPRK, has already made 2 senior appearances for Bayern Munich in the Bundesliga and is one of the most highly rated teenagers in Europe. This is who North Korea's under-17 men's team have just drawn against. Since then, they have knocked Venezuela out in the round of 32, teeing up a round of 16 tie with North Korea's rivals Japan. The evidence suggests that in both the men's and the women's games, North Korea are sitting on a golden generation. It's just that the men's game is extremely competitive at all levels, and in almost all countries, whereas so many countries still neglect the women's game that, in just treating the 2 equally, North Korea have the best youth, and one of the best senior women's teams on the planet. So, no. North Korea probably don't just win the Under-17 Women's World Cup so often, because they are secretly all 30-year-old men who have been told that they will be killed if they return to Pyongyang empty-handed. Now, before I am accused of being a useful idiot for Kim Jong-un, as happened the last 2 times that I made videos about North Korea, looking at where their 2010 World Cup squad is now, and where the reports that the DPRK falsified footage in order to claim to their citizens that they had won the World Cup was true, spoiler, it wasn't. That is not to say that bad things don't happen in North Korea, they very obviously do, and farcical as it is that I feel obligated to point this out, I am not a fan of totalitarian regimes. There, I said it. Lock me up and throw away the key. I just also don't think that it's useful to exploit that information vacuum in order to perpetuate completely baseless myths, and often quite dehumanizing myths, about an entire population of people who are already subject to intense repression, and I think that the reality of